We are live. I'm going to share my screen.
Well, welcome everyone to the March 28th meeting of the Assessment and Performance Subcommittee of PEPSC. We're glad that you're with us. This is our final meeting before we move as a subcommittee, before we bring our recommendation to PEPSC later in April. And we do have a few items to discuss in this subcommittee meeting to prepare for that presentation to PEPSC. Thanks, Kim. Everyone, I'll just remind us of the subcommittee charge. This is to bring forth a recommendation for discussion to PEPSC related to the repeal of the praxis core requirement that we currently have of the statute in terms of evidence to, and associated evidence related in support of this repeal. Kim, I think we can go to the next one. In terms of timeline, just consistent with what I mentioned a minute ago, this is our third meeting as a subcommittee, and it is our final meeting before we bring our recommendation to PEPSC. Kim, the date of the PEPSC meeting in April, do you happen to have that?
It's the 11th at 1 o'clock.
It's the 11th. Okay, so in just a few weeks. So this is it, everyone. So Kim, I think we can go to the next slide. For those on the call, and welcome Ann, I see you joined us as well. What we have in preparation for this meeting is initial language for the recommendation to PEPSC, but today in our meeting here in the subcommittee, we can discuss this, and that there are a few coming up in a further slide. There's a few other issues for us to consider that may change this, but the initial language, just as a starting place for us, is as follows. That the PEPSC Assessment and Performance Subcommittee recommends the removal of the praxis core as a requirement for admission into teacher preparation programs. Before we go any further, any comments, suggestions, concerns with this language as it's currently written? Yes, Ann.
Is there a part, thank you for this subcommittee for your work and all the things, because I completely agree with this recommendation, obviously. But is there a part about language somewhere about the SAT or ACT?
So yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, and I'll be up. I just put my video on here so we can see each other. So that's actually coming up on a later slide of what do we do with this? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Great. I'll be quiet. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah. No need to be quiet, but yes, great point. All right. So I'm just going to pause if any of the other subcommittee members have any thoughts that you'd like to share. And how about if we go to the next slide? Okay, so here are considerations for us, and we'll just go through these individually. The first one, and great timing, segue into this, is what does this imply with respect to the SAT and ACT requirement? It's my understanding that the actual requirement by statute is the praxis core, and that the SAT and ACT could be used to exempt you from that, if that's, or waive that requirement. But does this mean by moving this forward, and we did have a little discussion of this in our last meeting, does SAT and ACT, if we don't mention what this recommendation has to do with the SAT and ACT, does it create a complication for us as we move forward? In other words, do we need to be explicit that we're also discontinuing any use of the SAT and ACT as well? And I see you nodding your head. So
Yes. I think what we're saying is we want to get rid of the testing requirement.
the testing requirement.
Right.
So we could, for example, add in language into that says this is inclusive of any use of the SAT and ACT as a requirement for entry as well. For other subcommittee members, any thoughts on that?
This is Ida. I totally agree with adding that statement in there.
So do I, because wasn't the Praxis Core an alternate if you didn't have the SAT and ACT score? What was that the purpose of it?
Yeah, my understanding is it's the reverse, that the ACT and SAT could be used in place of the Praxis Core, but the Praxis Core is the requirement. And then
Okay.
if you right? But yes, but just to leave no ambiguity here, right, as to what we're implying. Kim, I'm wondering, could we go back a slide to the initial language so we could wordsmith a little bit? So we have this initial language of the recommendation. Yeah, right there. If we were going to wordsmith, anyone have a recommendation for a change in language that would then encapsulate the ACT and SAT?
Or can we say the Praxis Core or its equivalent substitutions of ACT and or SAT, something like that? I don't know.
I like it.
Usually usually
Equivalent.
DPI something.
Equivalent, say that again, Ann. Equivalent.
It was equivalent
Requirements.
substitution or
Yeah, or its equivalent substitutions of ACT or SAT or SAT or ACT. I don't know which order it's in. I don't know if it matters. Basically,
Do we want to say specifically SAT, ACT, or do we want to say equivalent substitutions because they could
right. They could then move to
add-
another
yeah, they could add
assessment.
a different assessment?
Yeah, I was thinking, something like, and or any other equivalent assessment that may be required, or something like that,
Or
right, because
any other
they could put
equivalent,
something else in.
equivalent what? Equivalent
I was
assessment
saying it was
substitutions?
yes, assessment substitution.
Okay. Is that right?
way better, way better.
Way,
Good.
way better. Yeah, no, that's great. Great ideas. Great input. All right, so I'm just reading this here. The PEPSC Assessment Performance Subcommittee recommends the removal of the Praxis Core or any other equivalent assessment substitution as a requirement for admission into teacher preparation programs. Any other thoughts on that specific language? And I just want to make sure, does this address the concern fully that you had in raising the ACT, SAT issue today in this meeting? Okay. I think, Kim, how about if we go back to the one slide forward that had the issues? All right, so a few other issues that have surfaced in relation to this. The first one is the ETS feedback on that the Praxis Core is predictive of passing the other content tests for licensure. And we have seen this in our North Carolina data itself. Does this issue make us vulnerable in bringing forth this recommendation? And related to that, the third bullet point down is, if so, do we want to consider a revision to our recommendation? I'm not advocating for this, but it has been surfaced. Do we want to consider a revision to the recommendation of not doing away with the praxis core necessarily, but to retain it simply as a mechanism for a diagnostic tool? So for example, if someone came in with a lower score on the praxis core, it could then provide information on where they may need additional supports.
I know this is, I think that EPPs should take the stance that we should help prepare people for licensure tests anyway. Because taking a test is not, is more of an artificial environment, so to say, than coursework, et cetera. So, you know, I think there are ways to take practice tests for licensure tests that could provide the same diagnostic information. So I know this is trying to think about what if they say NO, but I don't know that I think paying for a test where you could take a practice test, maybe it's putting in some kind of diagnostic tool where you know where your students are and having some plan for that. That might be something that the State Department might want to monitor, but I think that is good practice in a good EPP anyway, in my opinion. If you're looking at your data and your data saying no one's passing the high school math test, then what do? You dig in. That's me. I'll be quiet.
Yeah, what I'm hearing from you, Ann, is that you could still use some form of an assessment, be it a practice version of the praxis for diagnostic purposes. Having it included as a requirement doesn't help us at all, or certainly doesn't prevent us from doing that.
Right. Right. I would think that candidates would be like, what do you mean I just have to take this test, right? I mean, this seems, right.
I agree. It just seems like we would be asking them to spend money on something that we could handle ourselves within our programs.
Yep. Thanks, Ida. I'm also wondering, by virtue of, if you retain the praxis, even if it wasn't high stakes like that, does it still send the message of you have to take this test, right? It does cost money. And is there still a perception out there that you have to take this test and perform a certain way on it? Even if maybe you necessarily didn't, does it still become prohibitive?
And I would think that if I'm the person taking this test, even though you tell me I don't have to have this test to get into the program, I would still feel like I would have to achieve a certain score, because I think that would be indicative of whether you think I'm going to do better in the future.
Right. Yep. Any other thoughts on this particular point? Okay, so here's what I'm hearing from the group, is that at this point, the recommendation should be as we currently have it worded, and would not consider retaining the praxis in what I'll call a low stakes formative component, just for the reasons that we've cited. All right. And since you're here and you're with us, what we've discussed so far are the issues that have surfaced, not so much pertaining to the evidence of the recommendation, but just issues for us to consider as the recommendation comes forward. Since you're with us, are there any other issues that you feel as a subcommittee before we start reviewing the different components of the rationale for the recommendation? Do you feel there's any other issues we should be discussing as a subcommittee from your vantage point? Not to put you on the spot. No. Okay. All right. So let's then dive into the 4 primary components of our rationale, and this will be part of the presentation to PEPSC. The first one, and I'm just reading through the list here, is that it represents a barrier to admission, and we have the data. We have a very nice visual display that shows the spike in admission rates when this barrier was removed. So we have that data ready to go. The next point, well, before we move on to the next point, any questions or thoughts on that point? Okay. The next point is where we spent a lot of time looking at data, and this is where DPI ran a whole range of analyses. The first of which was hindering the diversification of the teacher pipeline. We saw that pass rates for candidates of color is notably lower than other candidates. And this was when we used the years, I think the year prior to the pandemic waiver, and then that year of the waiver during the pandemic. And then the next point is that when we actually look at the relationship between outcomes on the praxis score and later outcomes related to program completion and effectiveness, we don't see any relationship. And Kim, I wonder if we can go to the next slide that summarizes this. This was a slide put together by Andy Baxter. And so looking at those 2 years of data, the year before of the pandemic waiver, and then the year of the pandemic waiver of the praxis core, in that data, what we saw were that those failing the praxis core were more likely to be Black than Hispanic, multiracial, or white. And whether or not you passed the praxis core or not was unrelated to the rate at which you completed the EPP, the rate at which you passed the pedagogy license exam at TPA, for example, whether or not you taught within a year of completion of your EPP, ratings of effectiveness by your supervisor, evaluation ratings of proficiency, and meeting or exceeding expectations with respect to EVOS. The one area where there is a relationship is with the extent to which you pass the content license exams. So part of the thinking on this is a testing effect, right? If you tended to do better on the praxis core, you did tend to do better on the content license exams. So let me pause there. This will be part of the core information that we will relate on to PEPSC in the meeting in 2 weeks. Any questions or thoughts in relation to this? All right.
Randy, is there anything in y'all's information that explains that this is the only pathway that requires this?
And it's a great point. We don't currently have that in our documentation. You feel that could be a useful area to know?
I think that going forward is something that's not, because it's in the weeds thing, right? Like,
Yep.
So it's in the weeds that we know, and people on this call and this subcommittee know that if you're a residency teacher or an emergency permit teacher, that praxis core is not part of what you are required to do. That is only the undergrad, even the MAT program, praxis core is not what you're required to do.
Yep.
Once you have a 4-year degree, the praxis core is no longer a requirement. So I think it's important to think about the pathways and related to the licensure pathways, and to just put that out there as an information slide that I think is important to be cognizant about when they say, well, if someone were to say, well, we're lowering standards. Well, it's not a standard for every pathway. And there's nothing about the outcomes that say anything about because they're undergraduates, this matters, right? Like, so that's, to me, another argument.
Right, do you want to add that as a rationale?
That, I think that's up to the committee, but I think that would be a good idea, Kim.
Committee members?
I think that's a great point to add.
I do. Yes. Yes, I do too.
Yeah, I concur.
Okay,
What would we
great.
like to call
Sorry,
it?
I'm blowing up the meeting, but those are my points.
Great.
Pathway bias? I mean, what do we want to call that?
I would just say that that the use of the praxis core is not consistent across pathways
Yep.
So,
or something like that. I'm not a great wordsmither, so I'm not the, someone else can come
inconsistent
up with that.
requirement?
Kim is a great wordsmither. Yeah,
That was a great
inconsistent.
wordsmither.
Inconsistent.
It's only a requirement in traditional teacher education, undergraduate, traditional teacher education.
Yep. And thank you for that recommendation.
Sure.
All right, I'd like to move us up to what's currently the 1, 2, 3, 4th bullet point, which is trends from other states. This one, I think, is worthy of discussion, whether or not we want to include this in our recommendation coming to PEPSC, in part because it's my understanding that while other states have moved away from the praxis, it is itself inconsistent, and there may be contextual factors there that just may lead us to a situation of having to, it may open up areas that may complicate this recommendation. And do you happen to have other, I know you had some knowledge of this. Is there anything you'd like to share with the subcommittee around this?
The most, are you talking about other states that have dropped it recently?
Yeah.
I would say the most, I think the most recent was Tennessee, who does things very similar to us. Mm-hmm. So I think that's important for us to recognize that states like Tennessee, who have a very stringent testing system, have, require the EdTPA, do these other pieces that we do, that they have removed this.
And I'm aware that New Jersey has, it's a modified form though. It doesn't look, they've removed it for, I think, some of the pathways. Kim, did you happen to, I'm trying to remember of who was mentioning that they maybe had additional information on that.
We were going to try to see if we could get that information if we had a different kind of meeting, but we didn't need to have that meeting. So I'll do a quick search for Tennessee to see what's in the news media.
Okay. So I think to the subcommittee members, something to think about is that it is true that there are states who had been making this requirement who have dropped it. At the same time, it's not uniform, and it's my understanding that we don't have clear-cut information across all the states, and so it could be a discussion point. It could be opening an area though that could potentially make us a bit vulnerable in bringing forth this recommendation as well, because it's not uniform across the states. Any thoughts from other subcommittee members?
Well, in my opinion, if we don't have enough information, I don't think we should ever present something that we don't have enough information on. But again, like you said, it's up for discussion with everyone, but that is my personal opinion.
Thanks for that. Kim, when will we have to have, given that the meeting is on the 11th, we need to have slides in place about a week in advance?
Absolutely, to the public, you have to have it by the 9th.
Okay.
However, I like to try to have it to PEPSC members the week before.
Okay.
But you know, Randy, if we have a draft and we only make tweaks to it, that is something I can work with.
Okay.
I just need to give the public something.
Okay. So I'm wondering then, as we're creating the draft, I wonder if I'm concerned of bringing something in here that could just, open up space for, challenges to our recommendation. So I'm wondering, Kim, as we're moving forward and thinking about, and assembling the presentation for PEPSC, I'm wondering if we can do it in a way where if Anne's able to uncover or others are able to uncover things where it seems like it's really clear and useful, we could include it, but otherwise it would be pretty seamless to omit that.
Okay.
One other point, which is not on this slide, and I don't feel that we ever came around on it completely, is there are anecdotal occurrences where there are teachers who have very strong evidence of being highly effective, and yet we know that they did not pass the praxis core. And so that could be included as well. I'm looking at the NCACTI, which I think you all received as well. NCACTI put together a briefing for us on a range of evidence, and they've made mention of this as well. I'd like to hear your thoughts as a subcommittee. Do you want to include just information around anecdotal occurrences of this, which I don't think anyone would refute? It could be compelling. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that if you have any.
I think I told you at the group at the beginning of when we first started to meet that I actually have a instructional assistant here at my school that this was the story for her.
Yeah.
So I think it's super compelling because this is a person that when we couldn't find a teacher for the classroom, she was the long-term sub listed under, students have to be listed under a certified person in Power School. So she received an EVOS score, and she was our only person in our district in the 3rd grade that was blue in EVOS reading. And she was an instructional assistant that could not pass the praxis core to get into her program. Yet she was the only teacher in our district that was blue in EVOS reading. So I think those stories are compelling. I think they definitely add to the narrative that we're trying to talk about.
Thanks, Ida.
You're welcome.
And do you have a sense from your position? I think as the subcommittee, we've discussed this a couple times and we're pretty moved to include some anecdotal points in there.
I I think we can also just put it in context of, we've all heard the stories of people that could not get into teacher ed, the heartbreaking stories, right? Of people that could not get into a traditional teacher education program because they couldn't pass this test.
Yep.
And then give like, you know, I mean, we can all come up with one, right?
Yep.
And it stresses out the EPP more as much as it stresses out the student, right? It stresses out the principal as much as it stresses out the teaching assistant, right? Like it stresses everybody out because they can see the person in the classroom being successful, but they you know, they don't have this. So I think that the legislatures hear stories. So I think us including stories is not an inappropriate measure.
And
that's just my personal opinion.
Yeah. Thanks. And Kim, that was it. You just scrolled through, I think, the part of the NCACTA report that included. Yeah, there we are. In terms of the presentation to PEPSC, and Kim, I don't know if you have this information, are we permitted to share like names of individuals? Like, I guess what I'm wondering is that confidential?
Usually we aren't sharing names of individuals. However, I'm guessing that NCACTA got Ms. Francis's permission to share this, knowing that this would be a public piece of documentation after they gave it to PEPSC.
I can circle back around with them, and I'm guessing even if we can't share the name, we can share that.
Right.
You know that this teacher was right. Yeah. Okay, so here's what I'm hearing from the group. It could be and likely will be very compelling to include some of these anecdotal occurrences, and so we will include that in the presentation as well. Ida, as we're putting together the presentation, I wasn't taking notes when you listed off that all the indicators of effectiveness of the one teacher who you encountered, who, you know, from that perspective. Can we reach out and gather more information from you on that?
Absolutely.
Great, thanks. So Kim, I think we want to add under the rationale for recommendation, I'm wondering if it's a final point of examples of highly effective educators who did not pass the Praxis core. Kim, I don't have any in terms of the examples.
Do you just want to put the bolded part?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I don't have anything else.
And do you want to take this rationale piece and put it underneath the recommendation?
That sounds great. Yes, please. Kim, I'm going to ask what seems to be a silly question. Will we be building out a separate presentation for the PEPSC meeting?
I don't think so.
So this will be it in essence?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
This can definitely be it.
Yep.
I think and the other subcommittees, that's what they've done too.
Okay. Great. All right, everyone. So this is what I think this takes us through the information that we had coming into this meeting. I'm curious if there's any other information that you'd like to discuss or explore being integrated into the presentation to PEPSC. Anne, was that a hand up? Nope.
Randy, for the presentation to PEPSC, would you like the considerations and the summary of outcomes before the recommendation? Okay.
Yeah. Yep. Kim, Andy Baxter in his presentation had that graphic of the number of those enrolled in EPPs, and you saw the large spike up. Can we include that as well?
Sure.
And I think that would go just ahead of the slide of the outcomes.
Okay, I'm just going to add it as a note.
Yeah.
Awesome.
So I asked this question to everyone on this call here, and Kim, that includes you as well. Do we have enough? So we'll have the figure of the spike in enrollment the year that we had the Praxis Core waiver. We have the figure that shows the lack of relationship of what Praxis Core is and is not related to, and it's not related to the vast majority of factors related to teacher effectiveness. Do you feel that we need more visuals? I'm imagining presenting this to PEPSC. Do you feel that for PEPSC to follow the rationale and recommendations, it would be useful to have additional additional visuals in there? And I don't know how the other subcommittees are structuring it.
The other subcommittees don't have the same data display
Okay.
as you do. I think they've more summarized it bullet-wise as well. I don't know, do you feel like you need to have more graphics to demonstrate the summary of outcomes versus going through the summary of outcomes?
So I'm imagining that I will have to describe just a little bit of what the analyses were that were run. And then I think the graphic that Andy has prepared, which we have in there, is really helpful. So we can walk through that. I'm wondering, for example, do we need a slide, a graphic for the hindering diversification of the teacher pipeline that displays the information that Andy had provided to us from the DPI data? I could just read them out, but.
If you want me to add those particular slides, and then if anything else comes up in conversation, I can have them in the wings and you can pull them up rather than having to go through each of the slides.
Okay, that's great. Yep.
So what was the other slide that you were considering?
So I think there's the one, it's one of the first ones in Andy's slide deck where it shows the pass rates as a function of race ethnicity.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Sure. And then I'll just have his slide deck that he had before available. And then if somebody starts referencing and they want to actually see it, then that's when you can let me know that you want me to bring it up. And I'll just bring it up. Are you there in person, Randy, on the 11th?
Yeah, I'll be coming in person. Yep.
Okay, fantastic.
Great. Kim, is there anything that you're seeing that we're leaving out here?
No,
Okay.
no, I think we've been very thoughtful.
All right. Members of the subcommittee, anything else that you'd like to surface?
Do our surrounding colleges show a very low enrollment in the program?
Tracy, do you mean with respect to Praxis Core?
Yeah, into the education, yes.
So I wasn't able to secure that data. So let's see if I'm addressing the question you're asking. Is the question you're asking, do surrounding educator preparation programs, are they showing that the Praxis Core is limiting, I'm sorry, is your question, is the Praxis Core limiting enrollment, or is it just enrollment period?
I was thinking even just enrollment period.
Yeah.
That's on the
It
dashboard.
varies. Yeah, it's on the dashboard.
Yeah. I mean, what you would see on the dashboard is there's been a decline in enrollment in teacher education, right? That's one of the points you would see. And I think we can say that.
Yeah, and that will be in the figure, in the main figure that shows the spike in enrollment the year we took away the Praxis Core. You can similarly see the very strong downward trend around that spike. Any other issues you'd like to surface? And anything else from your vantage point?
I don't know about the trends from other states. I think we just have a general statement there. I don't think we have any specific information. When I tested somebody, they didn't have any specific information. So, I think we can mention it and try to see if we can. Betting Cacti stuff may have had some stuff in it about that. I'm not sure.
Yeah, and Cacti source looked like it was NCTQ for that.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So that's valid. So, yeah. And that the other thing that's not mentioned that we can decide, y'all can decide if you want to mention is we have, and Cacti has reached out about this. NC Forum has reached out about this. There's recommendations in the Governor's Drive Task Force. So it's not just PEPSC. You're seeing this in multiple policy groups that are interested in moving the needle on teacher ed.
Mm-hmm. And do you feel that we should include that under the specific points of rationale, or is that something that perhaps I can say in setting the stage?
Yes.
Yeah.
B. Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you.
Got it. Okay, everyone. If there's no other items to surface or recommendations, I think I'd like to recommend that we adjourn the meeting. I want to thank you all very much for your contributions. I think we're positioned well as we move into the PEPSC meeting. Thanks for all your contributions along the way, and I look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. Kim, thank you for all of your help, and Anne, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for listening to me.
You're welcome.
Thanks for your leadership, Randy.
You're very
Great
welcome,
job.
Kim.
Great job on this subcommittee. Did a great job.
Yep.
Have a good weekend.
Thank
Yep,
you.
you too. Ida and Tracy, thanks. See you soon.
Thank you.
Happy spring break.
Yeah.
Happy Easter.
Yes, happy spring break,
Easter,
people.
Happy
Bye.
spring break. Bye.
Bye.